car fixed yet? It's the Studebaker. Yeah, you know, the one with the little doggy in the window that goes...
Pratt falls off a couch. Just a woman standing on a fake talent show stage, singing her heart out, getting laughed at by strangers, and slowly falling apart in front of a live studio audience. The character's name was Eunice, and for years, people who worked on that show have said Carol Burnett could barely bring herself to watch it back. To understand why a 3-minute comedy sketch could hit her that hard, you have to go back to where Eunice actually came from, and it isn't a writer's room. It's Carol Burnett's childhood. Carol Burnett was born on April 26, 1933, in San Antonio, Texas, into a household that was already coming apart. Both of her parents struggled with alcoholism. Her father drifted between jobs, including work at a movie theater, but could never hold on to steady employment. Her mother wasn't emotionally available either, and both of them would eventually die of alcohol-related illness. Burnett has said plainly, in interviews over the years, that she doesn't remember a version of her early childhood that wasn't shaped by her parents' drinking. What saved her, in a very literal sense, was her grandmother, Mabel White Nanny, as Carol called her. In 1940, Nanny took Carol and moved them both to Hollywood, chasing not stardom but survival. What waited for them wasn't glamorous. They landed in a rundown single-room apartment in a boarding house full of people just barely holding their lives together. Folks fighting addiction, mental illness, and poverty all under one leaking roof. Carol and her grandmother lived on public assistance, stretching every dollar as far as it would go. But inside that chaos, Nanny gave her something her parents hadn't. Consistency. Someone who showed up. Someone who was, in Carol's own words, someone she could count on. It was a poor life, but for the first time, it was a safe one. Even so, money was so tight that basic comforts weren't guaranteed. Every Saturday, grandmother and granddaughter would scrape together enough coins for movies, a ritual that cost real money relative to what they had, but one Nanny insisted on. For a couple of hours in a dark theater, Carol got to disappear into a world where everything sparkled and nobody was struggling. It became one of the formative joys of her life, and arguably the first spark of what would become a lifelong love of performing. It was also in one of those darkened theaters that she first heard Johnny Weissmuller's Tarzan yell echo through the speakers. She was captivated, and she went home and practiced it obsessively, not realizing she was training the exact kind of vocal control and breath support that professional singers spend years developing. That yell later became one of her signature bits on stage, a party trick that turned into a career tool. Growing up, Burnett didn't dream of variety television. She wanted to be a journalist, partly because it was a dream her mother had once had for herself and never got to pursue. She set her sights on UCLA, but when it came time to actually enroll, she came up short of tuition money, a genuinely small sum by today's standards, but an impossible one for a family living on almost nothing. According to Burnett's own retelling over the years, an anonymous donor stepped in and covered the cost, with the only condition being that she never learned who they were. She kept that promise for the rest of her life. The identity of that benefactor was never revealed. At UCLA, she enrolled in journalism as planned, but theater elective changed the direction of her whole life. Something about being on stage unlocked a different version of herself. Funnier, louder, less afraid to take up space. Professors and classmates noticed a shift immediately, and by the end of her freshman year, she'd been recognized as one of the most promising newcomers in the theater program. She switched her major and never looked back. Not long after, while she was working as an usher and quietly pocketing party leftovers to bring home to her grandmother, she crossed paths with a wealthy stranger who, after hearing about her dream of trying to make it in New York, offered to fund the trip for her and her college boyfriend, with the same condition of anonymity. Stories like that repeat throughout Burnett's early life. People stepping in unasked because something about her drive made them want to help. New York wasn't kind at first. Money ran out fast, and Burnett has described moments early on where she nearly gave up and went home. She found a foothold at the rehearsal club, a boarding house for young women trying to break into the arts, and worked odd jobs while auditioning during the day. Her actual break came from something almost absurd, a comedic love song written about U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, about as unglamorous a subject for a love ballad as you could invent. She performed it with total commitment and became a viral moment of its era, landing her spots on The Jack Paar Show and, eventually, The Ed Sullivan Show in January 1957. From there, her career built steadily. A regular role on The Gary Moore Show through the late 1950s and early 60s sharpened her comic timing and earned her first Emmy. In 1959, she landed the lead role of Princess Winifred in the Broadway musical Once Upon a Mattress, a part that earned her a Tony nomination and proved she wasn't a passing novelty act. She was a genuine stage talent. In 1962, a televised concert special with Julie Andrews at Carnegie Hall became a critical and commercial hit, further cementing her as one of the most versatile performers of her generation. On September 11, 1967, The Carol Burnett Show premiered on CBS, and it stayed on the air for 11 seasons, wrapping up on March 29, 1978, after 279 episodes. It was one of the first variety programs to build its identity around live sketch comedy, performed in front of a studio audience, a format that would go on to directly influence Saturday Night Live and the entire genre of live sketch television that followed. Burnett wasn't just a star. She was one of the very few women of that era leading her own variety show at a time when the format was almost entirely run and hosted by men. The show became a launching pad for major comedic talents, most notably Harvey Korman and Tim Conway, both of whom developed into two of the most beloved comedic duos in television history. Korman and Conway had a famously unpredictable creative relationship. Conway, in particular, made a habit of holding back his best material until the actual live taping, refusing to tip his hand in rehearsals, which meant his castmates were often genuinely blindsided on camera. It's part why so many classic clips from the show feel so real, because the reactions were real. Cast members breaking character laughing wasn't a bit. It was actually happening. The show swept award after award over its run, collecting more than 20 primetime Emmys across categories like writing, choreography, and outstanding variety series, along with Golden Globes for Burnett personally and multiple People's Choice Awards. It's still remembered by television historians as one of the defining variety programs of its era, frequently appearing on lists of the greatest TV shows ever made. Amid all the wig gags, the send-ups of old movies, and the physical comedy, one recurring sketch stood apart. The Family, which followed a dysfunctional Southern household led by the sharp-tongued matriarch Thelma Mama Harper, played by Vicki Lawrence, and her long-suffering, emotionally volatile daughter, Eunice Harper Higgins, played by Burnett herself. Eunice wasn't a cartoon. She was loud, insecure, endlessly disappointed by her own life, and desperate to be seen as more than what her family thought of her. Burnett has said in interviews that a real piece of her own mother went into that character. Someone whose dreams never came true, who ached with a kind of unfulfilled longing that Burnett recognized because she'd grown up watching it firsthand. That's what made the February 1977 episode land so differently. In the sketch, Eunice gets her shot at being seen, an appearance on The Gong Show, the real, wildly popular amateur talent competition hosted at the time by Chuck Barris. Eunice is convinced this is her moment, her chance to finally escape her small, disappointing life and become somebody. She picks the song Feelings and performs it with everything she has. And then the panel, played by Jamie Farr, J.P. Morgan, the late Alan Ludden, gongs her before she can even finish. In front of a live audience, on television, the sketch doesn't play the moment for a punchline. It lingers on Eunice's face as the reality sinks in. This wasn't going to save her after all. Burnett has talked about the audience reaction to that scene in past interviews, describing letters from viewers who said it made them cry. Not laugh, cry. Because the camera held on Eunice's expression a beat too long enough for the comedy to curdle into something achingly sad. It's one of the few moments in the show's 11-year run that critics and historians still point to as proof that Burnett's talents went well beyond physical comedy, that she could locate real heartbreak inside a character built for laughs. Whether Burnett has actually avoided watching that specific episode back over the decades is harder to pin down than the popular retelling suggests. What is on the record is that the material clearly struck a nerve close to home, and that Burnett herself has acknowledged a personal overlap between Eunice's unfulfilled dreams and her own mother's. What's also on the record is that Burnett spent years afterward rewatching and revisiting the show's full archive, including, by her own account, all 276 episodes, while putting together her memoirs about the series. So the truth of that one episode's afterlife may be less about total avoidance and more about the specific, complicated feelings it stirs up every single time it comes back around. Either way, it's remembered as one of the rawest moments American television ever produced inside a comedy show. Burnett's personal life ran on a similarly steep, emotional gradient. She married her college boyfriend, actor Don Soroyan, in 1955. The marriage ended in divorce in 1962. She then married television producer Joe Hamilton in 1963, and the two had 3 daughters together, Carrie, Jody, and Erin, while Hamilton produced her show throughout its run. That marriage ended in 1984. In 1976, the National Enquirer published a false item claiming Burnett had been drunk and disorderly during an encounter with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger at a Washington restaurant. Burnett, a longtime outspoken critic of alcoholism, given her parents' history, sued for libel. The case dragged on for years and became a landmark in tabloid accountability. A jury initially awarded her over $1 million in combined damages, and though the amount was reduced on appeal, she ultimately settled for a substantial sum. For Burnett, the case was never really about the money. It was about refusing to let a lie about the one thing she'd spent her life fighting against go unanswered. The hardest chapter of her life, by her own account, involved her eldest daughter, Carrie. In her mid-teens, Carrie developed a serious substance abuse problem, cycling through addiction to multiple drugs during the late 1970s. Burnett has spoken candidly about the anguish of watching her daughter spiral, sending her through repeated stints in treatment, and eventually having to make agonizing decisions that Carrie resented her for at the time. Burnett has often repeated a version of the same sentiment, that loving a child sometimes means being willing to let them be angry with you, if that's what keeps them alive. Carrie did get sober, and the two eventually grew extraordinarily close, collaborating professionally and even co-writing a semi-autobiographical stage play, Hollywood Arms, based on Burnett's childhood. Tragically, Carrie died in 2002 from cancer that had spread to her lungs and brain. She was only 38 and never got to see the play open. Burnett has said she pushed forward with bringing it to the stage specifically because she felt she owed it to her daughter to finish what they'd started together. Burnett later found lasting happiness with her third husband, Brian Miller, whom she married in 2001. In more recent years, she and Miller took on custody of her grandson after her youngest daughter, Erin, struggled with her own addiction. Another instance of Burnett stepping in to hold a family together through crisis, decades after she first learned that skill from her own grandmother. What's remarkable about Burnett's career is that it never really stopped evolving. In 1997, she won an Emmy for a guest role on Mad About You, proving her range extended well past sketch comedy into subtler, character-driven work. She lent her voice to major animated films in the 2000s, including the blockbuster adaptation of Horton Hears a Who. She returned to Broadway at the end of the 1990s in Stephen Sondheim's, putting together 3 decades after she last performed on a Broadway stage. Then, well into her 80s and 90s, she kept surprising audiences all over again. In 2022, she appeared in the final season of Better Call Saul as Marion, an elderly woman who slowly uncovers the truth behind the show's central con man, a quiet, devastating performance that critics singled out as one of the show's most memorable guest turns. 2 years later, she starred in Apple TV Plus' Palm Royale, earning an Emmy nomination and becoming, at 91, the oldest female nominee in the award's history. Across nearly 8 decades in show business, Carol Burnett built a career on making people laugh, often at her own expense, with wigs, pratfalls, and characters engineered purely for silliness. But the Eunice sketch from February 1977 has endured in the cultural memory precisely because it broke that pattern. For a few minutes, the biggest comedy show on American television let the jokes stop being funny and let the audience actually feel something. It's not hard to understand why that sketch might sit differently with Burnett than any other bit she ever performed. She spent her childhood watching adults around her chase escapes that never came. Through alcohol, through fantasy, through a locked door at the end of a hard day. Eunice was, in a very real sense, built out of the same ache Burnett grew up surrounded by, performing that particular kind of disappointment, in front of a studio audience, night after night in reruns, forever. That's a different kind of exposure than doing a silly voice or a funny walk. Whatever her actual relationship with rewatching that specific episode has been over the years, the sketch remains one of the most quietly powerful things ever aired inside a comedy show, and a reminder that the woman behind so much of America's laughter spent her whole life turning real pain into something the rest of us could sit with, even for just a few minutes at a time.